If you were the main character of this story, would you have done what he did? This was the question posed by my professor in Christology to our class, and it has stuck with me since. He instructed us to watch this movie and to take note of our raw insights and reactions on it. And then one by one, he expected us to answer. My classmates gave varied answers. Some said yes, some said no. Most of them, I would say, gave clean, straight answers. But that wasn't the case for me. The movie I'm referring to is Silence, directed by Martin Scorsese, released in 2016. It is a very well-made film and is no doubt very theologically serious. I'd say that it's better than about 90% of the more explicitly Christian movies that we have out there. If you haven't seen it yet, I don't know what you're doing here. Go watch it first and then come back. I'll be here when you're done. If you have seen it, or if you're just decided not to see it, but you still want to watch this anyway, then let's begin this with a quick recap. Silence is based on a 1966 novel of the same name written by Shusaku Endo, a Japanese Catholic author. And right there, the combination is very interesting because he is Japanese and he is a Catholic who is writing about the persecution of Christianity in Japan. The story follows these two Portuguese Jesuit priests, Father Rodrigues, played by Andrew Garfield, and Father Garupe, played by Adam Driver. They travel to Japan in the 1960s because their mentor, Father Ferreira, played by Liam Neeson, has reportedly apostatized. So this movie has Spider-Man, Kylo Ren, and Qui-Gon Jinn, and all three of them are excellent in it. Father Ferreira renounced his faith under torture in Japan. The two young priests find this almost impossible to believe, and so they request permission to follow him to Japan in order to confirm if this story is true. What they enter then is one of the most brutal anti-Christian campaigns in history. Christianity in Japan started when Jesuit missionaries, including Francis Xavier, arrived in the mid-1500s. Historians generally estimate that by 1600, there were roughly 300,000 Christians in Japan. Because of this, some restrictions developed gradually in response out of fear of instability in the country and of foreign colonial influence from Spain and Portugal. In 1614, the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan officially banned Christianity, and the implementation of that ban was both violent and systematic. A lot of what Scorsese depicts in this film is historically grounded. Father Ferreira, for instance, Liam Neeson's character, is an actual Jesuit who renounced his faith. The torture that broke him is called the Anatsurushi, which is also depicted in the film. According to accounts, victims of the Anatsurushi were bound tightly and held upside down over a pit. These pits are said to contain filth and excrement. That's part of the torture. A small cut would be made near their temple so that blood would flow out of it smoothly and slowly rather than all of it pooling in the head, causing the victim to fall unconscious. This was done for two reasons. The first reason is so that the torture could be prolonged for days. And the second reason is that it was important for them that the victims were conscious, because only then can they renounce their faith. One free hand is left unbound during this entire thing, and when the victim is ready to renounce his faith, he would wave it around in order to call the attention of the nearest Japanese official. When he is ready to give up, only then will the torture stop. Another tool and method that the Japanese used is the fumie. The fumie is a bronze or wooden image depicting Jesus or Mary. When they realized that public executions created martyrs, there was a bit of a change in terms of their approach. A new method was introduced, getting the Japanese Christians to step on these images of Jesus and Mary in order to outwardly express their apostasy. These were powerful because these served as public renunciations and spiritual humiliation. And at the same time, it also helped identify Christians in hiding, because even the Christians in hiding would outright refuse to commit this act. Scorsese's film also depicts this in several portions of the film, including its climactic scene. The main character, Father Rodrigues, played by Andrew Garfield, is not a historical priest. He is more of a composite, a sort of a stand-in character in order for the film and the novel to ask the questions that it is asking. Two other characters that serve this role is Father Garupe and Kijichiro, who are very different from one another. Father Garupe, the priest that Father Rodrigues traveled to Japan with, was very zealous and very steadfast. He never once recanted his faith throughout the duration of the entire film, and even until the very end, he held on to it. There was a portion where he was lied upon. The Japanese officials who captured him told him that Father Rodrigues had already given up his faith. And along with him were these Japanese Christians who were also being punished. He died trying to save a tied-up woman who was thrown into the sea. And so he jumps down, swims, tries to save her, but all that effort was not enough. He ultimately gets dragged under along with her and drowns. He died trying to save others and holding on to his faith. Kijichiro, on the other hand, is the opposite. Unlike Father Garupe, he was a Japanese native. He was a Christian, but over and over throughout the course of the film, you find him recanting his faith. In fact, this begins even before the movie starts. He has already given up his faith and betrayed people along the way in order to save his own life. He has stepped on the fumier many times, and he appears, unlike Father Garupe, until the very end of the film. And that contrast between Father Garupe and Kijichiro is part of what makes this film brilliant, because we see two ways of approaching, of facing this kind of persecution. And what's interesting is that neither of them are the center of this film. The center of this film is someone who is in the middle, about to make his choice, and he is Father Rodrigues. In order to address the question this film is asking, we need to talk about the climax. After a long period of hiding and ministering to the Japanese Christians from the shadows, Father Rodrigues eventually gets captured, and he gets captured because he was sold by Kijichiro. And there, in his cell, he watches other Japanese Christians be tortured for their faith, the faith that they received from missionaries like himself. After a certain period of time, Father Ferreira, the mentor that they were looking for, eventually makes an appearance. He reveals himself to him and he confirms the news that he has indeed apostatized. And Father Ferreira's goal in approaching Father Rodrigues is to get him to do the same. So Father Ferreira, who was once a missionary, once a priest, is now working with the Japanese authorities. The Japanese authorities also had a shift in terms of their approach when it comes to the priests. What they realized is that merely killing the priests only made martyrs out of them. And so instead of torturing the priests, or maybe alongside the torture of the priests, what they did was they tortured the other Japanese Christians and made the priests watch. The deal was changed. It's no longer give up your faith and we'll let you live. Now it's give up your faith and we'll let them live. This is the tension that Father Rodrigues struggles with, because he was so ready to give up his life, but he wasn't sure if it was fine to let others suffer and die for him. And that's exactly what Father Ferreira points out, that they are not dying for God, they are dying for you. And this is what hits his conscience. And so Father Rodrigues, we see in the film, wavers between standing firm in his faith and encouraging others to recant their own faith. The film depicts instances of him telling the Japanese Christians to be strong and to remember the suffering of Christ. And it also depicts instances of him telling the other Japanese Christians who were being tortured in front of him to just recant, just give up the faith and live, survive. And so what we observe is a clash between these two ideas of what the right thing to do is in that moment. But the problem was, it didn't really matter what the Japanese Christians did, because what they wanted was not their apostasy, but Father Rodrigues' apostasy. So long as Father Rodrigues himself was not recanting his faith, they continued to torture and kill these people who already have. And so Father Rodrigues continued to pray fervently, desperately, hoping to hear from Christ, and it seems like he was met with nothing but silence, until the time when he was finally brought to the Fumie. During this time, there were 5 other Japanese Christians hanging over the pit, being tortured, and it seems like the only way to save them was for Father Rodrigues to give up his faith. They wanted him, not them. And in that moment, Father Rodrigues hears a voice that seemed to be Christ himself, telling him, "Trample. It was to be trampled on by men that I was born into this world. It was to share men's pain that I carried my cross." And Rodrigues steps on the image. Whereas Father Garupe held on to his faith and died in order to save his fellow Christians, Father Rodrigues gave up his faith and lived in order to do the same. So among the two of them, who was it who truly failed and truly succeeded? That is a very important question to think about, but that is not where the story ends. After this, Rodrigues is given a Japanese name, a Japanese wife, and a Japanese life. He continued to live the rest of his days under the supervision of the authorities as living proof that priests can be broken. In fact, there's even a scene where he and Father Ferreira were screening these foreign items in order to look for any sign of spiritual symbolism, Christian symbolism to be exact. Kijichiro also appears one more time. After many years of betraying God and betraying his fellow Christians over and over and over, he approaches Rodrigues, who is no longer practicing as a priest, and asks for confession. He had already renounced his priesthood at this point, but we get the sense that perhaps the door might still be open for him, that perhaps deep inside he is still Christian. The film ends with the death of Rodrigues. In the final shot, the camera zooms into his coffin as he is about to be cremated. Hidden within his closed hand is a small cross placed there by his Japanese wife, suggesting that perhaps, despite his public apostasy, something of his private faith has remained. That final image suggesting his private faith was added on by Scorsese. Shusaku Endo's original novel ended a bit more ambiguously. And that's where the film ends. So the question is, did Father Rodrigues do the right thing? The voice that he heard when he was in front of the Fumie, was that Christ? Or was that something else? These two questions, I believe, become the hinges by which Catholic commentators today differ in their interpretation of the film. In general, there are 2 views. The first view is that the voice really is Christ, and that what Rodrigues did was an act of love, not an act of betrayal. This is the reading of Father James Martin, a Jesuit priest who served as a consultant in the film. In a 2017 article written for America Magazine, he frames this scene as a difficult act of discernment that leads to what seems like a contradiction, which for him is not. His argument is that what we are witnessing is Rodrigues' Gethsemane, like Jesus who prayed, "Let this cup pass away from me," but ultimately submitted. Rodrigues also submits to what he understands God is asking of him in that moment. He writes, "Yet Jesus accepts his fate because this is what the Father asks. His actions make no sense outside of his relationship to the Father. Likewise, Father Rodrigues' actions make no sense outside of his relationship to Christ. In a sense, there is nothing subtle here. He apostatizes, finally, because Christ asks him to." From this point of view, stepping on the fumier was not an escape, but rather his own form of sacrifice. Father Rodrigues gave up his reputation, his role, his formed identity. He chooses something dishonorable. He loses everything publicly so that others might live. There is a second view, however, and that second view is that the voice was not Christ at all. In order to understand this, we must see that Father Rodrigues was presented with a dilemma. Give up your faith or else we will kill these people. That sounds like a black and white choice, but there's an entire aspect of this that's being ignored, and that is that Rodrigues himself was also a victim. Rodrigues did not torture anybody. He was not the one who put those people over those pits. It was the Japanese authorities. To place the blame on him for not saving the Christian captives would be the equivalent of blaming a hostage for not cooperating with the terrorists. From this point of view, he was under no obligation to cooperate with his torturers. And so if he refused to recant his faith, the blame should not be on him for not saving the Christian captives. To do that would be the very definition of victim blaming. And not only that, what's more is that the moment he steps on the fumier, those 5 people who were actively being tortured during that time do get spared. However, a bigger damage has been done. In giving up his faith, he validates the entire system that placed him there in the first place. He gives the Japanese inquisitor exactly what he wanted, a broken priest that they can parade around and use to do their bidding. He proves to the Japanese authorities and to the remaining Christians in hiding that this faith, under scrutiny, is meaningless. Torture us enough and we'll be ready to give it up. That is why, in this view, the idea is that the voice that Rodrigues hears when he was about to step on the fumier was not Christ, but rather his own. It was kind of his way of giving permission to himself for the sin that he was about to commit. He only heard what he wanted to hear because it wasn't God. It was him. He was merely looking for a way to justify his actions. So much more can be said about these two views, and one can say that you can make an honest, moral, and theological case for each of them from a believer's perspective. Personally, reflecting on this movie made me think of San Lorenzo Ruiz, our first Filipino saint. Lorenzo Ruiz was from Binondo, Manila. He was married, had 3 kids, and was active in the life of the church. In 1636, he was falsely accused of murder and was led to flee the Philippines. He joined a group of Dominican missionaries headed for Japan, not knowing what he was getting himself into. He was headed for the exact same persecution that Scorsese depicts in this movie. It was the same country, the same decade, the same methods. Upon arriving, he and his companions were arrested, imprisoned for 2 years, and later brought to Nagasaki where they faced trial by torture. First, there was what was called the mizuzere, or the water torture. Large quantities of water were forced down their throats, and then they were made to lie down with these long boards placed over their stomach. The guards would then step on those boards, forcing the water that they had just ingested out of the holes of their body. And then there was the anatsurushi, the upside-down pit torture that I told you about a while ago. San Lorenzo Ruiz went through that too. It was somewhere in the middle of all of this that San Lorenzo Ruiz reportedly turned to the interpreter and asked the question, "If I apostatize, will you spare my life?" He asked a very human question that I believe any of us would ask were we placed in the same situation. But then there was a shift. In the midst of his suffering, he grew bold. He refused to give up his faith until the very end. And after being hung in the pit for 3 days, he died on September 29, 1637. His last recorded words were, "I am a Catholic and wholeheartedly do accept death for God. Had I 1,000 lives, all these to him I shall offer." He was canonized in 1987 by Pope John Paul II as the first Filipino saint. And so, back to my professor's question. If you were Father Rodrigues, would you have done what he did? My answer to this question wasn't quite as clean as that of my classmates. What I said was this: I would want to be the kind of person who would not recant my faith. This is what my conviction tells me. When push comes to shove, I would want to be like San Lorenzo Ruiz, the kind of person who, even after asking a very human question, finds something beyond himself to answer it with, to hold on until the very end. But if that were to truly happen and I was put in that moment of testing, I honestly don't know what I would do. Would I remain steadfast or would I recant my faith? And if I do, would I do it for the right reason? Would I do it out of shame or pity for my fellow Christians who are being tortured on my behalf? Or would I simply do it out of fear for my own life? I have my ideals for sure, but I am aware that I have my weaknesses as well. And I think that is the most honest thing that I can say until now. If it isn't obvious yet, I lean more toward the second view, that what Rodrigues did was wrong. But I also cannot say for certain that I would have done it differently than he did. Not because I don't believe in my beliefs, but because I know I have my very real weaknesses. And that's a part of what makes martyrs like San Lorenzo Ruiz admirable, because they held on to this truth until the very end. I want to be like that too. You may or may not agree with the message Scorsese portrayed in this movie, but a movie being able to draw out questions such as these on faith and suffering is part of why it's better than 90% of what is out there. But what about you? What do you think? And what do you think would you have done? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if you have other movies you would like me to comment on, regardless of their genre, feel free to let me know. That is it for today. God bless.